Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm working really hard to reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. It's a truly important milestone for me. Please click the subscribe button on the channel. It's just one click, but it gives me massive motivation to keep making more videos. Thank you all so much. What if the greatest monster in your life was the man you married, and your only salvation was a ruthless criminal? For 3 agonizing years, Clarion bled in silence, behind locked doors. Then, a heavy knock echoed through the hallway. The man waiting was not the police. He was the devil himself. To the outside world, Clarion and David Miller were the quintessential Chicago power couple. David, a charismatic real estate developer, routinely graced the covers of local business magazines, a man whose smile could disarm a boardroom and charm socialites at the Drake Hotel charity galas. Clarion, with her soft features and quiet elegance, was the perfect accessory on his arm. They lived in a sprawling $10 million penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood, overlooking the unforgiving, icy waters of Lake Michigan. But the penthouse wasn't a home. It was a soundproofed vault. The abuse began 6 weeks after their lavish wedding in 2020. It started small: a shattered wine glass, a vicious reprimand over a misplaced set of keys, a tightly gripped wrist that left faint yellowing bruises Clarion had to cover with expensive silk blouses. David was a master of psychological warfare. He isolated her meticulously, systematically cutting off her ties to her sister in Seattle and her former colleagues at the design firm where she used to work. By the end of their first year, Clarion's world had shrunk to the cold marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment. By the second year, the violence escalated from outbursts to calculated beatings. David was careful never to hit her in the face where the country club wives might see, but her ribs, her back, and her thighs were a tragic canvas of his rage. When he shattered her collarbone in the winter of 2021, he drove her to Northwestern Memorial Hospital himself, his hand resting warmly on her knee in the waiting room. He told Dr. Harrison, a respected orthopedic surgeon, that Clarion had slipped on the icy marble steps of their foyer. The doctor nodded sympathetically, and Clarion, terrified of the man holding her hand, corroborated the lie with dead, hollow eyes. The third year was when the true nightmare began. Driven by a secret David was desperately trying to hide. The real estate market was shifting, but David's lavish lifestyle wasn't. Behind the designer suits and the latest Aston Martin, David Miller was drowning in debt. He had made catastrophic investments in a commercial district development in the South Loop, leveraging money he didn't have. When the banks finally cut him off, David turned to the shadows. He turned to the Chicago syndicate. As the pressure mounted, David's sanity frayed. He was drinking heavily, draining bottles of Macallan 25 by the hour, and his paranoia reached fever pitch. Clarion became his punching bag, the sole outlet for his mounting terror. He installed cameras in the penthouse. He tracked the GPS on her phone. He monitored her heart rate through her smartwatch, accusing her of conspiring against him if it spiked while he was out. November 14th, 2023, was a Tuesday. The city was being lashed by an unseasonal, violent thunderstorm. Rain hammered against the reinforced glass of the penthouse like bullets. Clarion was in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she poured a cup of tea, trying to brace herself. She knew the signs. David's car had pulled into the private garage downstairs, and the concierge had called up to announce him. When the private elevator doors opened, David didn't just walk out. He stormed out, bringing the smell of stale scotch, wet wool, and pure, unadulterated panic with him. His tie was undone, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Where is it?" he screamed, his voice tearing through the quiet apartment. "Where is what, David?" Clarion whispered, stepping back. her back hitting the cold granite of the kitchen island. The ledger, the encrypted drive I left in the safe. It's gone. He lunged across the room, his heavy hand connecting violently with her jaw. Clarion hit the floor hard, her vision exploding into brilliant white stars. The teacup shattered, sending scalding water and jagged porcelain across the tiles. She tasted copper immediately. "I don't know the combination to the safe, David. You know I don't," she sobbed, curling into a protective ball. He didn't listen. The beating that followed was the worst she had ever endured. For 20 minutes, the penthouse echoed with the sickening thuds of his boots and her muffled screams. He was punishing her, but he was also terrified, acting out the violence he knew was coming for him. Her ribs cracked, her vision blurred. As she lay bleeding on the white marble floor, staring at the flashing lightning outside the window, Clarion closed her eyes and finally prayed for death. She was ready. 3 years of hell was enough. But death didn't come. Instead, there was a sound so deeply out of place that it made David freeze mid-strike. Knock, knock, knock. Heavy, rhythmic, and demanding. Someone was at the front door. No one knocked on the door of the penthouse. Visitors were vetted by the lobby concierge, screened by security, and brought up via the private elevator. The stairwell doors were magnetically locked. For someone to be standing in their hallway, they would have had to bypass 3 layers of state-of-the-art security without setting off a single alarm. David turned pale. The rage in his eyes instantly dissolved into absolute, paralyzing dread. He backed away from Clarion's broken body, his chest heaving, his hands suddenly trembling. Knock, knock, knock. "David," a voice called from the other side of the heavy oak door. It was a smooth, calm baritone, carrying a distinct East Coast cadence. "We know you're in there, David. You missed our meeting at the harbor. That was very rude." David stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the shattered porcelain on the floor. "No," he whimpered. "No, no, no, not yet. I have until Friday." He scrambled to the console table, pulling open a drawer and withdrawing a sleek black 9mm handgun. His hands were shaking so violently, he nearly dropped the magazine before slamming it into the grip. "David, I'm not going to ask again," the calm voice outside warned. "Open the door, or my associates will remove it from its hinges. It's a beautiful door, custom mahogany, right? It would be a shame." David pointed the gun at the door, but he didn't shoot. He was paralyzed. Then came a deafening crack. The reinforced deadbolt didn't just break. The entire wooden frame splintered inward with explosive force, as a massive, broad-shouldered man kicked it open. The heavy mahogany door slammed against the interior wall, leaving a dent in the drywall. 3 men stepped into the penthouse. The 2 on the flanks were muscle, hulking, silent men in dark suits with broken noses and cold, dead eyes. But the man in the center commanded the entire room the second he crossed the threshold. Dominic Rossy was 34 years old, the underboss of the Rossy crime family, and a ghost to the FBI. He was dressed impeccably, in a charcoal 3-piece suit that clung to his broad, athletic frame. His dark hair was combed back, his sharp jawline shadowed by a faint scruff, but it was his eyes that froze the blood in Clarion's veins. They were a striking icy blue, entirely devoid of mercy. He looked like a man who had seen the depths of hell and decided he could run it better. Dominic stepped casually over the splintered wood, his hands resting easily in his pockets. He ignored the gun shaking in David's hand completely. "David," Dominic sighed, glancing around the opulent living room. $10 million for this view, and the roof still leaks? You really shouldn't have stiffed the contractors on the drywall." "Dominic, listen to me," David stammered, his voice cracking. I have the money. I just need 48 hours. The South Loop zoning permits are clearing tomorrow. I can liquidate the offshore accounts. You owe my uncle $4.2 million, David said. David, Dominic interrupted, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. You missed 3 payments. You ignored my phone calls, and then you tried to book a private charter out of Midway Airport to Costa Rica 2 hours ago. Dominic tilted his head. Did you really think I wouldn't know? David's face went chalk white. The gun wavered in his grip. I was just going to secure the funds. It was then that Dominic's icy gaze drifted down. He stopped speaking. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted, the temperature plummeting. Dominic saw Clarion. She was huddled against the base of the kitchen island, her face bruised and swollen, blood trailing from her nose and lip, her clothes torn. She was shaking violently, clutching her shattered ribs. Dominic's posture changed. The casual, relaxed mob boss vanished, replaced by a coiled predator. He stared at her, a strange, dark flicker passing behind his eyes. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a terrifying intensity. "Who did this?" Dominic asked. The question was spoken so quietly, it was almost a whisper, yet it echoed louder than David's shouting. That has nothing to do with this," David stammered, misreading the room entirely. He lowered the gun slightly, desperate to bargain. "Dominic, please, the debt. Take the penthouse. Take the cars in the garage. I'll sign over the deeds right now." Dominic didn't look at David. He took slow, deliberate steps across the room until he was standing just a few feet away from Clarion. The 2 massive enforcers at the door shifted, their hands resting on the grips of their holstered weapons, eyes locked on David. "I asked," Dominic repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "Who did this to her?" David swallowed hard, the panic making him reckless. "She's my wife. She fell. It's none of your business. Dominic, please listen to my offer. The house? The house is already ours, David," Dominic said coldly. "We put the lien on it this morning. The cars are impounded. Your bank accounts were frozen by my people at noon. You have nothing. You are nothing." David fell to his knees, dropping the gun. It clattered against the hardwood floor. He was sobbing now, a pathetic, sniveling mess. The monster who had tormented Clarion for 3 years was reduced to a crying child. "Please," David begged, crawling forward on his hands and knees. "I'll do anything. I'll work for you. I have connections at City Hall. I have her." Clarion's heart stopped. She stared at her husband in absolute disbelief. David pointed a trembling finger at Clarion, his eyes wide with manic desperation. "Take her. You like her. She's yours. Use her to pay off the interest. Rent her out. Do whatever you want with her. Just let me walk away." A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the penthouse. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass. One of Dominic's enforcers, a man named Enzo, let out a low, disgusted breath, his hand tightening on his weapon. Even hardened killers had a code. Dominic didn't blink. He slowly turned his head to look at David, who was kneeling in a puddle of spilled tea and rainwater. For a long moment, Dominic just stared at the pathetic creature on the floor. Then Dominic reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. David flinched, waiting for the bullet. Instead, Dominic pulled out a pristine white linen handkerchief. He crouched down, his expensive leather shoes resting on the blood-stained tiles. He ignored David completely, bringing himself down to Clarion's eye level. Up close, Clarion could smell him, cedar, rain, and gunpowder. He didn't touch her. He simply held out the handkerchief. His icy blue eyes met her terrified brown ones. 3 years ago, Dominic spoke directly to her. his voice astonishingly gentle. "I sat in the back row of a cathedral and watched you marry a man I knew was a parasite. I wondered how long it would take for the golden cage to rust." Clarion gasped, the pain in her ribs forgotten as shock washed over her. He knew her name. He'd even attended her wedding. "Take the handkerchief to Sorrow," Dominic murmured, his voice low. "Wipe your face, because the woman walking out of this penthouse with me tonight is not a victim. She's going to be the reason this city burns." Clarion's trembling hand reached out, her bruised fingers brushing against the crisp white linen of Dominic Ross's handkerchief. It felt absurdly soft against the harsh reality of her bloodied skin. As she pressed it to her split lip, the scent of cedar and rain enveloped her, grounding her chaotic thoughts. Dominic's icy blue eyes held hers unflinching, devoid of the pity she had come to loathe in the rare glances of strangers. He didn't see a broken thing. He saw someone who had survived. "How do you know my name?" Clarion whispered, her voice rasping in the quiet of the shattered penthouse. "Arthur Pendleton was a good man," Dominic said softly, the mention of her maiden name sending a jolt through her spine. "Your father was one of the few honest judges in Cook County. When my grandfather was facing a rigged indictment, orchestrated by a corrupt district attorney 10 years ago, your father threw the case out. He didn't take a bribe. He just looked at the law and did what was right, knowing it would cost him his political career." Dominic paused, his jaw tightening. "The Rossy family does not forget a debt, and we do not forgive a betrayal." Behind them, David was still on his knees in the puddle of rainwater, his pathetic sobs echoing off the high ceilings. He looked between Dominic and Clarion, realization slowly dawning on his terror-stricken face. "You," David stammered, wiping snot from his nose with the back of his trembling hand. "You planned this. You trapped me. The zoning permits, the union strikes on the South Loop project. That was you. You orchestrated my bankruptcy." Dominic stood up slowly, the fluid grace of a predator returning to its full height. He turned to face David, the brief warmth he had shown Clarion vanishing instantly. "I merely accelerated the inevitable," Dominic stated, buttoning his suit jacket. "David, you are a greedy, incompetent fool. You borrowed money you couldn't launder, invested in properties you couldn't develop, and tried to pay off my uncle with empty promises. But that is just business. I deal with idiots every day." Dominic took a slow, deliberate step toward the kneeling man. "What makes you special, David, is that you are a coward who hides behind a $10 million mortgage while he beats a woman who weighs a fraction of what he does." Dominic gestured to the shattered porcelain on the floor. "And a coward who kills his father-in-law for an inheritance." Clarion stopped breathing. The pain in her ribs vanished, replaced by an icy, paralyzing shock. "What did you say?" she gasped. David recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his face draining of whatever color remained. No, that was an accident. The police report said black ice on Interstate 90. He lost control of his sedan." Dominic gestured casually to the hulking enforcer on his left. "Enzo." Enzo reached into the inner pocket of his dark suit and retrieved a small metallic rectangle, a silver USB drive. Clarion recognized it instantly. It was the encrypted drive David had been tearing the penthouse apart to find. "You see, Clarion," Dominic said, his gaze fixed on David's horrified face. "David here is not just a monster. He's an arrogant one. He likes to keep trophies. He likes leverage. When my men quietly cracked the safe in your study this morning, while David was out trying to beg for a loan, we expected to find our missing ledger. We found it. But we also found audio recordings, bank transfers to a mechanic in Skoy who specialized in cutting brake lines, emails detailing how to funnel Arthur Pendleton's life insurance and estate directly into a failing real estate holding company. The room spun. Clarion gripped the edge of the granite kitchen island, pulling herself up. Her legs shook, but a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. 3 years ago, she had lost her father in a tragic winter crash. It was the grief that had driven her into David's arms, seeking the protection and comfort he had so flawlessly faked. He had played the grieving, supportive fiancé perfectly. He hadn't just caged her. He had slaughtered the only family she had left to build the cage. "Clarion, sweetie, please," David begged, his voice high-pitched and hysterical as he crawled toward her, ignoring the mobsters in the room. "He's lying. He's a criminal, a murderer. You can't listen to him. I love you. I did everything for us." Before David could reach her, Dominic moved. It was terrifyingly fast. Dominic's heavy leather shoe slammed into David's chest, sending the developer sprawling backward onto the hard marble floor. David gasped for air, clutching his sternum. Dominic stepped over him, his foot coming to rest heavily on David's throat, pinning him to the ground. "Do not speak to her," Dominic commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl. "Do not look at her. You lost the right to speak her name the first time you laid a hand on her." Dominic looked over his shoulder at Clarion. "The drive has everything, Clarion. The financial fraud, the embezzlement, and the undeniable proof of your father's murder. Tomorrow morning, a courier will deliver copies to the FBI, the IRS, and the Chicago Police Department. But before the law gets to him, I need to know what you want me to do with him tonight." David whimpered beneath Dominic's boot, his eyes rolling back in terror. Clarion stared down at the man who had been her husband, her jailer, her torturer. She saw the blood on her own hands. She felt the sharp, agonizing pain in her shattered ribs. She remembered the nights locked in the closet, the gaslighting, the psychological torment that had stripped away her identity until she was nothing but a ghost, haunting her own life. She looked at Dominic, a ruthless, dangerous man who stood in her living room like a dark, avenging angel. "I want him to lose everything," Clarion said, her voice surprisingly steady, ringing clear over the sound of the storm outside. "I want him to be stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. But I don't want him dead, Mr. Rossy. Death is a release. I want him to spend the rest of his miserable life in a concrete box, looking over his shoulder, knowing that the man who put him there is untouchable. I want him to live in fear, exactly like I did." A slow, dark smile spread across Dominic's face. It was a terrifying, beautiful expression. He removed his foot from David's throat. "Enzo, Leo," Dominic said smoothly. "Take the garbage out. Bring him to the warehouse by the docks. Make sure he understands exactly who he belongs to before we hand him over to the federal authorities on Monday. Oh, and Enzo, break his hands. Both of them. Clumsy people shouldn't handle real estate." "No, Dominic. Please. Clarion." David screamed as the two massive enforcers hauled him off the floor by his armpits. He thrashed and kicked, but he was nothing against their brute strength. They dragged him toward the splintered doorway, his expensive shoes scuffing the marble, his screams echoing down the private hallway until the elevator doors closed, cutting off his cries abruptly. The penthouse was suddenly deafeningly quiet. Dominic turned back to Clarion. He didn't rush her. He didn't invade her space. He simply extended a hand. "Come with me, Clarion," he said gently. "There is a car waiting downstairs, and a private doctor at my estate who won't ask questions. Your time in the dark is over." Clarion looked at his outstretched hand. It was the hand of a criminal, a man who commanded violence with a simple nod. But as she placed her bruised, trembling fingers into his warm, calloused palm, Clarion knew one undeniable truth. She had never felt safer in her entire life. 6 months later, The golden cage of the Gold Coast penthouse was a distant memory, replaced by the sprawling fortified stone walls of the Rossy estate in Lake Forest. The transition hadn't been easy. The trauma of 3 years of relentless abuse didn't vanish just because the abuser was gone. There were nights when Clarion woke up screaming, thrashing in the silk sheets of her guest bedroom, terrified that the heavy footsteps in the hallway belonged to David. But every time the door opened, it wasn't David. It was Dominic. He would sit in the armchair in the corner of her room, reading a book under a dim lamp, a silent, immovable guardian. He never pushed her. He never demanded gratitude or affection. He provided her with the finest trauma therapists, the best physical trainers, to rebuild her atrophied muscles, and most importantly, space. Slowly, the ghost of Clarion Miller faded, and Clarion Pendleton re-emerged, forged in fire and tempered by steel. She gained weight, her hollow cheeks filling out, her skin glowing with health. She learned how to defend herself, spending hours in the estate's private gym with Enzo, learning how to throw a punch, how to disarm an attacker, how to channel her lingering rage into power. The dynamic between her and Dominic shifted subtly. It started with quiet breakfasts on the terrace, overlooking the heavily wooded grounds. It evolved into late-night conversations by the fireplace in his study, where she learned that the ruthless underboss was also a brilliant strategist, a man who preferred leverage over bloodshed, and who carried the weight of a violent empire with a weary, calculating mind. And then there was the trial. David Miller's downfall was the media spectacle of the decade. The evidence Dominic had anonymously provided to the federal prosecutors was airtight. The financial fraud alone was enough for 20 years, but the conspiracy to commit murder bumped the sentence to life without the possibility of parole. Clarion attended the sentencing in federal court. She wore a tailored crimson power suit, her hair styled immaculately, her posture rigid and unbreakable. Dominic sat 2 rows behind her, flanked by his men, a silent shadow of absolute authority. When David was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to his waist, he looked hollowed out, his hair thinning, his eyes sunken and darting with paranoid terror. He looked at Clarion, desperate for a shred of the timid, broken girl he had controlled. Instead, Clarion met his gaze with eyes as cold and dead as the bottom of Lake Michigan. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply smiled, a sharp, chilling smile that made David physically recoil. He realized in that agonizing moment that she wasn't just surviving, she had transcended him. Later that evening, the Rossy estate was quiet. Clarion stood on the balcony of the master study, a glass of vintage Barola in her hand, watching the snow begin to fall over the dense forest perimeter. The heavy oak door behind her clicked open, and Dominic stepped out onto the balcony, the chill winter air swirling around his dark suit. "The warden at Marion Supermax owes my uncle a favor," Dominic murmured, stepping up beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. "David is being placed in general population. He won't last a year." Clarion took a slow sip of the wine. "He'll live every day of that year in absolute terror. That's enough." Dominic looked at her, his icy blue eyes catching the dim light from the study. The intense predatory hunger that he usually kept buried beneath layers of calculated control was vibrating just beneath the surface. "You look beautiful in crimson to sorrow," he said softly. Clarion turned to him. For 6 months, they had danced around the undeniable magnetic pull between them. It was a dangerous game. He was a king of the underworld, a man whose hands were stained with blood. But Clarion had learned the hard way that the men who wore legitimate suits and smiled for the cameras were often the real monsters. Dominic was a criminal, but he was honest about his darkness. He didn't hide his demons. He leashed them, commanding them to protect her. "I owe you my life, Dominic," Clarion said, her voice now steady, stripped of vulnerability, replaced by absolute certainty. You owe me nothing, Dominic replied, stepping closer, his hand reaching up to gently cup her jaw. His thumb brushed against the faint, faded scar on her cheekbone, the last lingering reminder of David's wrath. I didn't save you to collect a debt. I saved you because the world is a darker place without your fire. Because you belong beside me, not beneath a coward. Clarion leaned into his touch, her heart pounding a steady, fearless rhythm against her ribs. She didn't want to be a mafia boss's charity case. She didn't want to be protected in a tower. She wanted to rule alongside the man who had handed her the sword. Then don't ask for a debt, Clarion whispered, her gaze dropping to his lips before rising to meet his eyes. Ask for a partner. Dominic's breath hitched, the raw power of her words shattering his last restraint. He pulled her against his chest, his mouth crashing down on hers with a fierce, consuming hunger. It wasn't the tentative kiss of a savior. It was the claiming of an equal. Clarion kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair, burying the ghost of her past in the ashes of the empire they were going to build together. She had spent 3 years bleeding in a golden cage, begging for a savior. But the man who had finally walked through the door hadn't given her salvation. He had given her an empire, and Clarion Rossy was ready to reign. Did this story of ultimate revenge and dark romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved Clarion's journey from a broken captive to an untouchable queen of the underworld, hit that like button right now. Share this video with fellow Mafia romance lovers. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling, twist-filled, dramatic story. Drop a comment below. What would you have done?